The wind across Redemption's Gulch carried the grit of 1,000 failed dreams. It scoured the clabbered faces of the buildings until they were gray as bone and whistled through the gaps in their teeth. For Alaris Vance, it was the sound of her world shrinking, the sound of a cage door swinging shut. She stood on the porch of the small, defiant homestead her father had built, a solitary island in the vast sea of Silas Croft's ranching empire. Her son, Thomas, barely 6 years old, sat on the steps, tracing patterns in the dust with a stick, oblivious to the shadow that was falling over them both. Ilara watched the dust cloud on the horizon long before it resolved into a carriage. It was too fine, too polished for this part of the territory. It moved with an arrogant surety, a black beetle crawling inexorably toward her. She felt the familiar knot of ice form in her stomach. Her father had been gone 6 months, the victim of a sudden violent fever the town doctor had called a tragedy. Alara called it convenient. Convenient for the man who held the note on every board of this house, every acre of this dry, stubborn land. She smoothed the front of her worn calico dress, a gesture of defiance more than neatness. Pride was the only currency she had left. When the carriage stopped, the dust settling like a shroud, Silas Croft descended. He was a man carved from avarice, his waistcoat straining at the buttons, his face flushed with cheap whiskey, and an overabundance of self-satisfaction. He moved not like a man who owned the land, but like a man who believed the land was grateful for his ownership. "Mistress Vance," he boomed, his voice a wet, fleshy sound that always made her skin crawl. He tipped his hat, a gesture that was more mockery than courtesy. Two of his men, hulking figures with the dull-eyed look of loyal hounds, remained by the carriage, their hands resting near their hips. "Mr. Croft," she replied, her voice level. She would not give him the satisfaction of her fear. Thomas had stopped his drawing and now stood half-hidden behind her skirts, his small hand gripping the fabric. Croft's eyes swept over the homestead, the patched roof, the sturdy but small barn, the hand-dug well. His gaze lingered on the small trickle of water that fed her garden, the very reason for his visit. The Vance spring was modest, but it was the only reliable water for 10 miles in any direction, a secret her father had guarded jealously, a secret Croft had undoubtedly uncovered. "A hard life for a woman of your breeding," he said, letting the word hang in the air, "and for the boy." He gave Thomas a smile that held no warmth, a predator's baring of teeth. "It need not be this way." Ilara remained silent, a pillar of salt and resolve. She knew this speech. It was the third time she had heard it. "My offer stands," he continued, taking a step onto the porch. She instinctively took a step back, pulling Thomas with her. "The debt on this place considerable. Your father was a poor businessman for all his education. My father was an honest man," she said, the words sharp as flint. Croft chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "Honesty is a luxury, my dear, one neither of us can afford. Marry me. The debt vanishes. The boy will have a father, a name of consequence. You will have security. This pathetic plot of land will be absorbed into my holdings, as it should be." He made it sound like a favor, a grand act of charity. But she saw the greed in his eyes, the hunger for the last piece of the valley he did not control. He didn't want a wife. He wanted a title deed. "The answer's the same as it was the last time, Mr. Croft. No." The false bonhomie vanished from his face, replaced by a mask of cold fury. The flush in his cheeks deepened. "You are a widow in disgrace, your father's bank a ruin. You have nothing. You are nothing. Do not mistake my generosity for weakness, and do not mistake my refusal for coyness." She shot back, her chin high. "This is my home. It is my son's home. It is not for sale, and neither am I." For a long moment, he just stared at her, his little eyes boring into her. The wind kicked up, throwing dust against the porch. Then a slow, ugly smile spread across his lips. "There are other ways to collect a debt," he said softly. He turned on his heel without another word, climbed back into his carriage, and left her standing in a cloud of his triumphant dust. The ice in her stomach was no longer a knot. It was a frozen certainty. He had not been making an offer. He had been delivering an ultimatum. The next day, they came for her. Not Croft's hounds, but the law. Sheriff Miller, a man whose spine was made of Croft's gold, arrived with two deputies. They found her hanging laundry, the clean scent of lye soap, a stark contrast to the foul business they represented. Ilara Vance, Miller said, not meeting her eyes. He was chewing on a piece of straw, his gaze fixed on some distant point over her shoulder. You're to come with us. On what grounds? She demanded, her hand still holding a wet sheet. Vagrancy, debt default. Disturbing the peace, he mumbled. The charge is vague and nonsensical. She was on her own property. Her debt was a civil matter. The only peace being disturbed was her own. This is absurd. This is Silas Croft's doing. Miller's jaw tightened. Mr. Croft is a concerned citizen, is all. Worried about you and the boy out here alone. It ain't proper. He finally looked at her, and she saw the shame warring with his fear. Just come along quiet, Ilara. It'll be easier. But she wouldn't. She stood her ground. And so they took her. One deputy pulled her arms behind her back, while the other stood by, looking uncomfortable. They dragged her from her home, past her clothesline with its flapping white flags of surrender. Thomas began to cry, a high, terrified wail that tore at her soul. Mama! It's all right, Thomas, she cried out, twisting against the deputy's grip. Stay in the house, lock the door. They pulled her toward their horses, her boots scraping paths in the dirt. They were halfway to town, a public spectacle of humiliation, when they passed the mercantile. The townspeople, the Greek chorus of Redemption's Gulch, stopped to watch. They stared from doorways and windows, their faces a mixture of pity, fear, and a certain grim satisfaction at seeing the mighty fallen. The banker's daughter dragged through the street like a common drunk. In front of the mercantile, a man was loading sacks of flour onto a pack mule. He was a mountain of a man, dressed in buckskins that had seen years of hard use. His hair was long, the color of dark river stone, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy of motion, each action precise and powerful. When he heard the commotion, he stopped and turned. Ilara had seen him before, perhaps twice, in all her years here. He was a ghost of the mountains, a trapper who came to town for supplies once or twice a season and spoke to no one. Jedediah Stone, they called him. His face was a landscape of hard miles and old sorrows, with a scar that cut through his left eyebrow, giving him a permanent look of grim appraisal. He was immense, well over 6 feet, with shoulders that seemed to block out the sun. He watched them approach, his eyes, the color of a winter sky, missing nothing. He saw the sheriff's bluster, the deputy's discomfort, and the terror in her own face. He saw Thomas, who had followed them, running to keep up, his face streaked with tears and dust. As they drew level with him, Sheriff Miller puffed out his chest, asserting his authority in the face of this silent granite observer. Just upholding the law, Jedediah, Miller said, a little too loudly. Woman's a vagrant, causing trouble. Jedediah Stone didn't look at the sheriff. His gaze was fixed on Ilara, on the raw marks the deputy's grip was leaving on her arms. He took in the scene, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she thought he would just turn back to his mule, another passive observer in her degradation. Then he moved. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't raise his voice. He simply took one step forward, planting himself in their path. The sheer, immovable mass of him was enough to halt the procession. The air crackled with sudden tension. The murmuring of the onlookers died away. He let the silence stretch, a weapon in itself. Finally, his voice came, a low rumble like stones shifting deep underground. It was a voice unused to conversation, rough with disuse, but carrying an undeniable weight. He looked directly at Sheriff Miller, clear his throat. On what charge? The question was simple, direct. It cut through all the blustering pretense. Miller blinked, taken aback. I told you, vagrancy. She has no visible means of support. Jedediah's gaze swept over her, then back to Miller. She lives on her own land, in her own house. That ain't vagrancy. His eyes were cold. Chips of ice. Try again. She's She's defaulted on a debt to Mr. Croft, the sheriff stammered, his authority visibly shrinking. Debt is a civil matter, not a jailing offense, Jedediah stated. It was not a question, it was a fact. You know that. On what charge are you putting your hands on this woman in front of her child? The sheriff's face was turning a blotchy red. He was being challenged publicly by a man the entire town was secretly afraid of. He gestured vaguely with his free hand. Look, Stone, this ain't your concern. This is official town business. Jedediah ignored him. He reached into a leather pouch at his belt and drew out a smaller, heavier deerskin bag. He tossed it to the ground in front of Miller's feet. It landed with a soft, heavy thud, the sound of finality. Gold dust muffled by leather. What's her debt to Croft? He rumbled. That's that's private information, Miller said, flustered. $500, Ilara said, her voice shaking but clear. It was an astronomical sum, inflated by Croft's predatory interest rates. Jedediah grunted. There's more than that in the bag. Consider it a fine for your incompetence. He looked at the deputy holding Ilara. He didn't say a word, but his eyes were a command. The deputy's hands fell away from her arms as if they'd been burned. Ilara rubbed her wrists, staring at the mountain man in disbelief. He had not only intervened, he had paid a fortune to a man he clearly despised, for a woman he did not know. The townspeople were gaping. Sheriff Miller looked from the pouch on the ground to Jedediah's implacable face and knew he was beaten. To press the matter would be to invite a violence he was not equipped to handle. Take your gold, Miller spat, trying to salvage a shred of dignity, but stay out of town business. He and his deputies mounted their horses and retreated, leaving the bag of gold lying in the dust. The street was silent for a long moment. Then Thomas ran to his mother, burying his face in her dress, his small body racked with sobs. Ilara knelt and held him, murmuring reassurances she didn't feel. When she looked up, Jedediah Stone was still there, watching them. His expression had not changed. He bent down, picked up the deerskin pouch, and held it out to her. This is yours now, he said. I I can't pay you back, she whispered, her throat tight. Wasn't asking you to, I said, his voice still a low growl. He looked west, toward the mountains, where dark clouds were gathering, pregnant with snow. The wind had a new, sharper bite to it. Storm's coming, a bad one. He looked back at her and her son, then at her small, isolated homestead, a vulnerable speck in the distance. You can't stay there alone. Not now. It was not a suggestion. It was another statement of fact. Before she could protest or even process what was happening, he had finished loading his mule, gathered her and Thomas, and was escorting them back the way she had come. He walked beside them, a silent, brooding guardian, his rifle held loosely in one hand. He was a force of nature, as wild and unpredictable as the coming blizzard, and he had just placed himself squarely between her and Silas Croft. She was no longer alone, but she had no idea if she had been rescued or merely claimed by something even more dangerous. The cabin was a fortress of silence. Outside, the world had dissolved into a maelstrom of white. The blizzard had hit with the force of a physical blow, erasing the landscape, muffling all sounds save for the relentless shriek of the wind. Inside, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire in the stone hearth, the soft breathing of Thomas asleep in his small bed, and the profound, unnerving quiet of the man sitting at her table. Jedediah Stone had not spoken more than a dozen words since they'd arrived. He had moved with an instinctual competence that was both reassuring and intimidating. He checked the seals on the windows, chinked a drafty spot near the door with a rag, and brought in a mountain of firewood from the lean-to, enough to last for days. He worked without pause, a machine built for survival. Now he sat, cleaning his rifle with meticulous care, the metallic scrape and click of the components punctuating the heavy silence. Ilara felt like a stranger in her own home. She sat in her father's rocking chair, clutching a cup of tea for its warmth, and watched him. He was a creature of the wilderness, caged within her four walls. The firelight played over the hard planes of his face, deepening the shadows, catching the silver in his beard. She tried to reconcile the brute force of his appearance with the quiet way he had laid a spare blanket over Thomas, his huge, calloused hand surprisingly gentle as he tucked it around the boy's shoulders. Mistrust was a bitter taste in her mouth. No one did anything for nothing in this part of the country. His intervention in town had been a public declaration, an act of war against Silas Croft. Why? Why involve himself in her troubles? What did he want from her? The gold he'd offered sat on the mantelpiece, a heavy, unanswered question. He finished with the rifle, reassembling it with a final, satisfying snap. He leaned it against the wall near the door and finally looked at her. His winter sky eyes were direct, missing nothing of her apprehension. "He'll send men," Jedediah said. It wasn't a guess. "Soon as the storm breaks." "I know," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "This cabin won't hold against a determined push. The windows are too big. Doors thin." He was assessing it like a military tactician, his gaze sweeping the room, noting its vulnerabilities. "It's all I have." The words were stark, stripped of all pride. He gave a short, sharp nod, accepting the fact without pity. Pity was a weakness, and this man seemed to have none. He stood up, his sheer size seeming to shrink the small room even further. He went to the water bucket, ladled a drink, and drank it down in 3 long swallows. He moved like a wolf, with a contained power that was both unsettling and, to her shame, strangely comforting. For the first time in months, she was not the only one standing guard. The storm raged for 2 days. They existed in a timeless bubble, a world reduced to firelight and shadow. They settled into a tense, unspoken rhythm. He would rise before dawn, his movements unnaturally quiet, and tend the fire. He would hunt in the small barn, setting snares for the rabbits and grouse that sought shelter there, returning with fresh meat. She would cook, mend Thomas's clothes, and read from the one book her father had left her, a worn copy of Shakespeare. The words of kings and poets seemed a world away from this raw, elemental struggle. He ate with a focused intensity, as if storing energy for a long fight. He never spoke unless necessary, and his questions were always brief and to the point. "More wood? Is the boy warm enough? Where's the salt?" Yet, in the silence, she began to see things. She saw the way his eyes would soften almost imperceptibly when he looked at Thomas. She saw the tension in his shoulders when the wind rattled the window panes, a constant state of vigilance. She saw the deep, abiding weariness in his face when he thought she wasn't looking, a sorrow so profound it seemed etched into his bones. On the second night, Thomas's breathing became ragged. A cough started, dry and hacking at first, then deep and wet in his chest. A fever followed, his small body burning with it. Ilara's fragile composure shattered. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. The town doctor was miles away, on the other side of an impassable blizzard. She bathed his forehead with a cool cloth, her hands trembling. He was muttering in his sleep, his face flushed. Jedediah watched from across the room, his stillness a stark contrast to her frantic worry. "It's the lung fever," she said, her voice tight with panic. "The same thing they said my father." She couldn't finish the sentence. He came over to the bed, kneeling beside it. He placed his large hand on Thomas's chest, feeling the rattle of each breath. He was not a doctor, but he was a man who understood the mechanics of life and death in their most brutal forms. "We need to break the fever," he said, his voice low and calm, a rock in her sea of panic. "Keep him warm. Get liquids in him." He stood and went to his pack, rummaging inside. He came back with a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. He opened it to reveal dried herbs, willow bark for the fever, and yarrow to make him sweat. He showed her how to brew a bitter tea from the bark and steep the yarrow. He held Thomas up while she spooned the liquids into his mouth. They worked together through the night, a silent, desperate team, he with his mountain knowledge and she with her mother's fierce love. There was no room for mistrust, only for the shared, singular purpose of saving the boy. Sometime before dawn, as the storm outside began to lose its fury, the fever broke. Thomas's skin grew damp with sweat, and his breathing eased. He fell into a deep, natural sleep. Alara slumped into the rocking chair, utterly spent, tears of relief carving clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. Jedediah added a log to the fire, the flames flaring up, illuminating the quiet cabin. He poured her a cup of the willow bark tea. Drink, he commanded softly. She took it, her hands still shaking. She looked at the strange, savage man who had saved her son. Why? She finally whispered, the question she'd been holding back for 2 days. Why are you doing this? He stood by the fire, his back to her, staring into the flames. The silence stretched, and she thought he wouldn't answer. A man like Croft, he began, his voice a low rasp. A man who takes what he wants, who uses the law as a club to beat down the weak. I've seen it before. He turned to face her, and in the flickering light, she saw the raw pain in his eyes. The scar on his brow seemed deeper, whiter. I had a wife, a daughter. We had a small ranch down in the Colorado Territory. Good land. Good water. He paused, the memory a heavy weight. A man came, a baron like Croft. He wanted our water. He tried to buy us out. We refused. So he used the law. He had a judge in his pocket. He claimed our deed was fraudulent. He brought in hired guns to enforce the eviction. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, the knuckles white. I was away selling horses. When I came back, his voice broke, a sound of pure agony. They were gone. My wife, my little girl. The house was burned to the ground. The neighbors said she fought back. They called it resisting arrest. Alara gasped, her own troubles paling in comparison to the scorched earth of his past, the haunted look, the reclusive life, the deep-seated code of honor. It all snapped into focus. He wasn't just fighting for her. He was fighting a ghost. I found the men who did it. He continued, his voice flat and dead, more chilling than any rage. The Baron, his sheriff, his guns. I made them answer for it. Then I came up here, to the mountains, where there are no deeds, no judges, only rock and skaas. He looked at her, his gaze intense. When I saw that sheriff put his hands on you, in front of your boy, I saw it all happening again. I will not let it happen again. Now she understood. This wasn't charity. It was a reckoning. He had seen his own past reflected in her present. Her fight was now his. He won't stop at sending men, will he? She said, the realization dawning. It's not just the land, it's not just the water. No, Jedediah agreed, his eyes hard. It's about breaking you. It's about proving he has the right to. Alara stood up, a new fire kindling inside her, forged in the fear for her son and tempered by the steel of Jedediah's story. Her father's last words to her, whispered in his feverish delirium, came back to her. The ledgers, Alara. The truth is in the ledgers. Don't let him have them. He murdered my father, she said, the suspicion finally hardening into a conviction. My father was a banker. He kept records for everyone in this valley, including Croft. Just before he died, he found something. Proof that Croft built his entire fortune on stolen claims and swindled deeds. He killed him to silence him, and he's been trying to get his hands on this property ever since because he thinks the ledgers are hidden here. She went to the hearth, her movements sure and certain. She pried loose a stone at the side, one that had always been slightly crooked. Behind it was a small cavity, and inside that, a tin box wrapped in oilcloth. She pulled it out and placed it on the table between them. This is why he wants me gone, she said, her hand resting on the box. This is the truth. Jedediah looked from the box to her face. He saw the fear was still there, but it was now overshadowed by a fierce, unyielding resolve. She was no longer just a victim to be protected. She was a partner in his war. The silent assessment was over. The uneasy truce had been forged into a true alliance, bound by shared loss and a common deadly enemy. the storm outside was ending, but the storm inside the cabin was just beginning to gather its strength. The world outside the cabin was born anew, pristine and silent under a thick blanket of snow. The fury of the blizzard had been replaced by a crystalline stillness, but it was a deceptive peace. Every snapped twig, every shadow stretching long and blue across the white, felt like a threat. They were exposed. Jedediah moved with a hunter's purpose, his senses on high alert. He spent the morning circling the property, his snowshoes making the only tracks in the virgin snow. He was reading the land, learning its rhythms, its sight lines, its weaknesses. He returned to the cabin as the sun reached its zenith, his face grim. "They'll come from the east, using the ridge for cover," he announced without preamble, shaking the snow from his coat. "They can get within 200 yards before we'd see them. We need to be ready." Ilara nodded, her hands busy loading her father's old rifle. The feel of the weapon was unfamiliar, but not entirely foreign. Her father, a man who had valued books over bullets, had nonetheless insisted she learn to shoot. "A woman alone in this country needs to know how to make a man listen from a distance," he had told her. She had thought it a morbid joke at the time. Now it felt like a prophecy. They worked together, their movements economical and synchronized, their shared purpose a silent language between them. They boarded up the large front window, leaving only a small slit to see through. They moved the heavy table against the door, reinforcing it. Alara filled every bucket and pot with snow, setting them near the fire to melt for water. Jedediah took his axe and spent an hour in the stand of pines behind the barn, returning with several long, sharpened stakes, which he drove into the ground at strategic points in the snow, crude but effective obstacles. Thomas, recovered from his fever, but pale and subdued, watched them with wide, anxious eyes. He understood that the game had changed. The monster from the stories his mother read him was real, and these preparations were for him. Ilara paused to hug him, her heart aching. "You are to stay under the bed when the time comes. Do you understand, Thomas? No matter what you hear, you stay there until I come for you." He nodded, his small face a mask of solemnity. "Will Jedediah protect us?" he asked in a small voice. "We will protect each other," she answered, meeting Jedediah's gaze across the room. A flicker of something, respect, understanding, passed between them. The waiting was the hardest part. The sun began its slow descent, painting the snow in hues of orange and purple. The beauty of it was a cruel mockery. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching hoofbeats. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into the shape of a man. They came just after dusk, as the world was fading into shades of gray. Jedediah saw them first, a line of dark figures moving against the snow-covered ridge. "4 of them," he said, his voice a low growl. He didn't sound surprised or afraid. He sounded ready, like a wolf that has been backed into its den. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. She took her position at the small side window, the rifle stock cold and hard against her cheek. She could see them now, moving with a swaggering confidence, believing they were attacking a lone woman and a child. "Hold your fire until they're past the stakes," Jedediah commanded from his post at the boarded-up front window. "Make every shot count. Aim for the center of the body. Don't think, just shoot." The men drew closer, their dark coats stark against the snow. One of them carried a torch, its flame a single angry orange eye in the twilight. Arson. They weren't just here to scare them. They were here to erase them. The sight of that flame burned away the last of Alara's fear, leaving only cold, hard rage. The lead man stumbled as he hit the line of unseen stakes, cursing loudly. The element of surprise was lost. "Now," Jedediah said. The report of his rifle was deafening in the enclosed space, a crack of thunder that echoed across the silent valley. One of the figures in the snow cried out and fell. Before the echo had faded, Ilara had her own target in her sights. She squeezed the trigger, the recoil jolting her shoulder. She didn't know if she hit him, but the man scrambled for cover behind a snowdrift. The night erupted into chaos. Gunshots answered them from the darkness. A bullet splintered the wood of the door. Another shattered the remaining pane of glass in the side window, showering Alara with cold air and sharp fragments. She ducked down, reloaded, and came back up, her movements becoming more mechanical, more instinctual. They were a surprisingly effective team. Jedediah was a terrifyingly efficient fighter, each of his shots placed with deadly precision. He moved between his firing slit and the door, a silent, lethal force. Alara, driven by a primal need to protect her son, found a steadiness she never knew she possessed. She wasn't a marksman, but her shots kept the attackers pinned down, unable to advance with the torch. One of the men made a desperate rush for the barn. Jedediah's rifle barked once. The man fell and didn't move again. There were two left now, hiding in the darkness, their courage clearly failing them. They had expected an easy job, not a fortified position defended by a ghost of the mountains and a she-cat with a rifle. A few more sporadic shots were fired, but their hearts weren't in it. Then silence. After a long, tense minute, they heard the sound of men retreating, their boots crunching in the snow as they ran. Jedediah didn't relax. He remained at his post, his rifle ready, scanning the darkness. "Stay down," he warned. "It could be a trick." They waited for what felt like an eternity, the silence broken only by the whistling of the wind through the broken window and the whimpering of Thomas from under the bed. Finally, Jedediah seemed satisfied. "They're gone," he said. The adrenaline drained out of Alara, leaving her weak and trembling. She leaned her forehead against the cold wall. The smell of gunpowder thickened her nostrils. She had fired a gun at another human being. She had taken part in a battle for her life. The woman she had been just a few days ago, the banker's daughter who worried about mending dresses and making stew, was gone forever. In her place was someone harder, someone colder, a survivor. She went to Thomas, pulling him from his hiding place and holding him tight, rocking him as he cried. Jedediah began methodically clearing the broken glass, his practical actions a grounding force in the chaotic aftermath. He found a piece of canvas in the barn and nailed it over the broken window, shutting out the cold. When he was done, he came and stood near the fire. He had a shallow graze along his forearm, a dark line of blood welling up. "You're hurt," she said, her voice hoarse. "It's nothing," he grunted. She ignored him, tearing a strip from a clean sheet and fetching the whiskey her father had kept for medicinal purposes. She dabbed at the wound, cleaning it. His arm was corded with muscle, hard as oak. He stood perfectly still, watching her, his expression unreadable. His proximity was overwhelming, a field of heat and raw power. "They'll be back," she said, her hands busy with the bandage. "Croft won't accept this. He'll send more men." "Yes," Jedediah agreed. His eyes met hers, and the space between them felt charged, electric. "We can't win a siege. We fortified this place, and they'll learn from that. Next time, they'll just burn it from a distance. We can't wait for them to come to us." "What do you mean?" "I mean the fight isn't here," he said, his voice low and intense. He gestured toward the tin box containing the ledgers, which still sat on the table. "The fight is in town. Power like Croft's is built on fear. The people in that town are afraid of him, but they hate him more. That box, that's not just proof, it's a weapon. And we're going to use it to tear his whole rotten world down around him." He was right. Hiding was no longer an option. Surviving the night wasn't a victory, it was merely a postponement of the inevitable. The only way to win was to stop defending and start attacking. The only way to secure her home was to leave it, to walk into the heart of her enemy's power and confront him directly. It was a terrifying thought, but as she looked at Jedediah's resolute face, she knew it was the only path left. The dawn broke cold and clear, the sky a pale, unforgiving blue. They left the homestead as the first rays of sun touched the snow, leaving behind the bodies of the two men Croft had sent. They were a grim testament to the night's battle, a warning that Jedediah left intentionally. There would be no hiding what had happened here. The journey to town was a silent, tense affair. Jedediah led the way on foot, his long strides eating up the miles, his rifle at the ready. Alara followed with Thomas on the pack mule, the tin box of ledgers tucked securely in a saddlebag. She felt horribly exposed, a target in the vast white emptiness, but Jedediah's presence was a shield. He moved like he was part of the landscape, his eyes constantly scanning, missing nothing. He was the predator now, not the prey. They didn't go straight into Redemption's Gulch. Jedediah led them on a wide, circuitous route to the south, approaching the town from the back, through a ravine that offered cover. The whole town will be watching the main road, waiting for Croft's men to return, he explained. No one will be looking this way. His plan was simple and audacious. They wouldn't sneak in. They would walk into the one place where Silas Croft's power was absolute, the Grand Saloon. They would do it in the middle of the day, when it was full of the ranchers and prospectors Croft had been bleeding dry for years. They would confront him not with guns, but with the truth. It's a fool's errand, she whispered as they tethered the mule behind the blacksmith's shop. He'll have you shot before you can say a word. He might, Jedediah conceded, checking the load in his pistol, but men like Croft, their power is a performance. They need an audience that fears them. If that audience sees him challenged, if they see he can bleed, the fear starts to crack. That's our only chance. He looked at her, his expression serious. Stay back, near the door, with the boy. Keep this safe. He handed her a small, concealable pistol from his pack. If it goes bad, run. Don't look back. Her hand closed around the cold metal. I'm not running, she said, her voice firm. He held her gaze for a long moment, then gave a single, sharp nod. They walked on to the main street. The town was buzzing with a nervous energy. People stared as they saw the two figures emerge from the night, the giant mountain man and the disgraced banker's daughter. They saw the blood on Jedediah's sleeve, the grim set of Alara's jaw. And they knew something had shifted. The Greek chorus fell silent, retreating to their doorways to watch the final act. The swing doors of the Grand Saloon were a gateway to the enemy's lair. Jedediah pushed them open and stepped inside. Alara followed a pace behind, her hand on Thomas's shoulder, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. The saloon fell silent. The tinkling of the piano stopped mid-tune. Men froze with glasses halfway to their lips. At a large table in the back, surrounded by his cronies and the shamed Sheriff Miller, sat Silas Croft. He was holding court, laughing at some joke, his face flushed with power. When he saw them, the laughter died in his throat. His face paled, then contorted with rage. Stone, Croft snarled, getting to his feet. His men stood with him, their hands moving toward their guns. You have a death wish walking in here. And you, he sneered at Alara, bringing your brat into a saloon. You have no shame. Jedediah ignored the men, his focus entirely on Croft. He walked slowly toward the center of the room, his boots heavy on the wooden floorboards. He stopped, a solid pillar of granite in the middle of the room. Your men didn't return last night, Croft. Jedediah's voice rumbled, filling the cavernous space. They came to Mistress Vance's home to burn out a woman and her child. They failed. A wave of murmurs swept through the room. Men exchanged glances. They had all heard the rumors of Croft's methods, but this was the first time anyone had dared to say it aloud. To his face. Lies, Croft bellowed, his face turning purple. They were serving a legal eviction notice. You murdered them in cold blood. He pointed a fat, trembling finger at Jedediah. Sheriff, arrest this man. Sheriff Miller made a move, then stopped, caught in the crossfire of Jedediah's icy stare and Croft's furious command. He hesitated, a man torn between his master and his own survival. This isn't about last night, Jedediah continued, his voice calm and steady. This is about the last 10 years. This is about stolen mining claims. It's about ranchers who lost their land to fraudulent deeds. It's about every man in this room who has been squeezed and threatened into selling his future to this man for pennies on the dollar. The murmurs grew louder. Men were nodding, their faces dark with long-held grievances. Croft's eyes darted around the room, seeing his audience begin to turn. The foundation of fear was cracking. And it's about Arthur Vance, Jedediah said, his voice dropping, each word a hammer blow. A good man who kept this town's books. A man who discovered the truth of your empire, Croft. A man who died of a very convenient fever right after he found the proof. He turned and looked pointedly at Elara. Taking her cue, she stepped forward from the doorway. All eyes fell on her. She held up the tin box. My father's ledgers, she announced, her voice ringing with a clarity and strength that surprised even herself. Every crooked deal, every forged signature, every theft, it's all in here. He didn't just build a ranch, he built a criminal enterprise on the backs of all of you. That was the moment the dam broke. A prospector in the corner shouted, "He stole my claim, said the assay was worthless." Another man slammed his fist on the bar. "My water rights! He diverted the creek and dried me out." The room erupted in a chorus of angry accusations. Croft's face was a mask of pure panic. His performance was over. His audience was gone. All he had left was brute force. "Shut up," he screamed, his voice cracking. "All of you, kill them!" He shrieked at his men. "Kill them now!" The saloon exploded into violence. Croft's henchmen, loyal to the pay, if not the man, drew their guns. But Jedediah was ready. He moved with a speed that was terrifying in a man his size. His pistol was out, and he fired twice before the first henchman had cleared his leather. Two men went down. The other saloon patrons, their courage ignited by the truth and a decade of resentment, joined the fray. Tables were overturned. Fists flew. It was a brawl, a chaotic uprising. Alara shoved Thomas behind the bar, shielding him with her body as she held the tin box like a sacred relic. Jedediah was a force of nature in the center of the storm, dispatching Croft's remaining men with brutal efficiency. He moved through the fight, his eyes locked on his true target. Silas Croft, the great baron, the master of Redemption's Gulch, was revealed for what he was, a coward. He wasn't fighting. He was scrambling, trying to get to the back door. As he scrabbled at the latch, he saw Alara and Thomas behind the bar. A vile, desperate idea lit his eyes. He lunged, not for the door, but for the boy. "Thomas!" Ilara screamed, shoving her son away as she raised the small pistol. But Jedediah was faster. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, a blur of buckskin and fury. He grabbed Croft by the collar and hauled him back, spinning him around and slamming him against the wall with enough force to shake the entire building. Croft's gun clattered to the floor. Jedediah's massive hand was around Croft's throat, lifting him off his feet. The Baron's face went from purple to blue, his legs kicking feebly. All the fight, all the bluster, all the arrogance was gone, replaced by a primal, pathetic terror. He was just a fat, greedy man choking on the consequences of his own evil. The fighting in the saloon died down. Everyone stopped to watch the final, silent confrontation. Jedediah held him there, the man's life in his hand, and for a terrifying moment, Ilara saw the ghost of his own past in his eyes. She saw the husband and father avenging his murdered family. Then his gaze flickered to her and to Thomas, who was peering over the bar, safe. The rage in his eyes subsided, replaced by something else, justice, not vengeance. He loosened his grip just enough for Croft to draw a ragged, wheezing breath. "It's over," Jedediah growled, his voice a final judgment. He slammed Croft back against the wall, and the man slid to the floor in a whimpering heap. Sheriff Miller, seeing which way the wind had blown, scurried forward with a pair of handcuffs. The townspeople, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning liberation, closed in around their fallen tyrant. The reign of Silas Croft was finished, not with a bang, but with a pathetic, gasping whimper. His power had been a house of cards, and the truth had been the wind that blew it all away. In the quiet that followed the storm of violence, the Grand Saloon felt like a consecrated space. The air, thick with the smell of whiskey, sweat, and gunpowder, was also charged with a strange new lightness. The townspeople, who for so long had lived under the shadow of Silas Croft's thumb, were now standing taller, speaking to one another in tones of disbelief and newfound camaraderie. They were taking back their town. Jedediah stood apart from it all, a silent monolith near the fire, reloading his pistol with the same deliberate care he'd shown in the cabin. He had been the catalyst, the righteous fury that had shattered the old order, but he seemed to have no interest in the new one being forged. His war was over. Alara found him there after ensuring Thomas was safe with the blacksmith's wife, a woman who had once crossed the street to avoid her, but who now couldn't stop thanking her. She walked over to Jedediah, the tin box of ledgers still clutched in her hand. "They're talking about making you the new sheriff," she said quietly. He snorted a dry, humorless sound. Snorts, "I'm no lawman." He slid the pistol back into its holster. "My work here is done." A cold dread washed over her, colder than any fear she'd felt during the fight. He was going to leave. He would melt back into the mountains, back to his solitude and his ghosts, and she and Thomas would be left alone again. The thought was unbearable. "The gold," she said, forcing the words out. "The pouch you gave me. It's back at the cabin. I'll get it for you." He turned to face her fully. The firelight cast deep shadows on his face, but she could see the weariness in his eyes had returned, deeper than ever. "Keep it. You and the boy will need it to rebuild." "No," she said, her voice stronger now. "It was never about the money. I can't repay you for what you've done, for my life, for my son's life, but I will not be in your debt." Pride, she realized, was a foolish thing to cling to now, but it was all she had. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense. "You're not in my debt, Alara," he said, and the sound of her name in his rough voice sent a shiver through her. "We fought a common enemy. That's all." Was that all it was? She asked, her heart in her throat. The silence between them was filled with unspoken things. The shared vigil over her sick son, the desperate fight in the cabin, the look in his eyes when he had saved her from Croft. It was more than a common enemy. It had been a partnership, a bond forged in fire and fear. He looked away from her, toward the swinging doors, toward the street, toward the mountains that called to him. She saw the conflict in him, the pull of his old life of solitude warring with this new, fragile connection. "The cabin needs a new door," she said, her voice soft but firm. "The windows need glass. The barn, there's a hole in the roof from a stray bullet." She was listing chores, mundane tasks, but what she was really doing was building a future, laying out the planks and nails of a life she hoped he would want to share. "It's too much work for one person." He was silent for so long she thought she had lost. She felt her hope begin to wither. He would nod, wish her well, and walk out that door forever, leaving a hole in her life far bigger than the one in the barn roof. Then he sighed, a long, slow release of breath that seemed to carry the weight of years with it. He turned back to her, and his eyes were no longer those of a haunted man looking at the past, but of a man tentatively, cautiously looking at the present. A faint, rare smile touched the corners of his mouth, a barely perceptible shift, but to her it was like the sun breaking through the clouds. "Aye," he rumbled, "that's a fair bit of work." He reached out and his large, calloused hand gently took the tin box from her. He set it on the bar, a symbolic unburdening. Then his hand found hers, enveloping it in warmth and strength. "We should get started." And in that simple touch, in those few words, a commitment was made. They walked out of the saloon together, leaving the noise and the politics of the town behind them. They walked back onto the main street, where the afternoon sun was bright on the snow, and started the long walk home. Not to her home or his past, but to theirs, the place they had fought for, the place they would build together. Years fell like snow, each one covering the last, until the hard, frozen ground of the past was transformed into a fertile landscape of the present. The Vance homestead became the stone ranch, and it thrived. The little spring, once a secret, became the heart of their prosperity, watering herds of cattle and fields of hay that were the envy of the valley. The cabin grew, room by room, built by Jedediah's strong hands, each new board a testament to their shared life. Alara filled it with warmth and laughter, and the ghosts that had once haunted its corners were banished for good. Thomas grew into a fine young man, with his mother's sharp mind and Jedediah's quiet strength, and soon his laughter was joined by that of two younger sisters, girls with their mother's fiery spirit and their father's winter sky eyes. Jedediah's stone never fully lost the wildness of the mountains, but he tethered it to his family, becoming their unshakable rock, their fierce protector. The scars on his face remained, but they were softened by the lines of laughter around his eyes. He never became sheriff, but his name became the law in that valley, a law of honor, fairness, and quiet courage. The story of the mountain man and the banker's daughter, of the showdown in the Grand Saloon, became a local legend, a tale told around campfires to remind people that true power isn't held by the man who shouts the loudest, but by those who have something worth fighting for. They had found more than just justice in the dust of Redemption's Gulch. They had found a home, an anchor, and a love as solid and enduring as the mountains that watched over them.